Hello and welcome to the Laser Focus. This is our fourth wartime episode of the podcast. Would you believe it? I'm Lazar Berman. I am your host. Now, we are at a somewhat curious point in this war. After the initial strikes, after taking out Ali Khamenei, some of the top leaders, after a lot of very important successes, we've reached kind of a different phase of this war. Now, there's no question that Israel is continuing to hit key Iranian sites, whether it's military commanders, whether it's their arms industry. At the same time, we see that the Iranian regime, or at least their military, is still able to operate coherently. They're still able to fire. We're recording on Thursday afternoon. Today, there's already been at least 8 launches at central Israel. There might even be more, God forbid. But we see that the Iranians are able to control their fire. They're able to respond in a coherent fashion. We also, the big news of this week, saw that President Trump surprised a lot of us with this bombshell announcement on Monday that he is engaged in talks. This is what he says, with the Iranian regime, or at least some members of the Iranian regime. And he is talking to them about a total end to the war. Now, this obviously sent the Israelis scrambling to come up with a reaction. It took over 7 hours for Prime Minister Netanyahu to come up with a very short 30-second video responding to it. But now the focus is on, are these talks going to happen? What are the conditions of the talks? Is there any chance of reaching an agreement to end the war? What does it mean for the survival of the regime? And what does it mean for Israel? To talk about all these things, I think we have the best person in Israel to discuss this with us, to walk us through it. I'm here with Dr. Raz Zimmt. He is the director of the Iran and the Shiite Axis Research Program at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. Welcome, Raz. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into this fascinating discussion, I'm sure we're going to take a quick break and then we'll be back. And we are back with Dr. Raz Zimmt of the INSS. So let's start just big picture about the Iranian regime right now. Who is running the thing? Is it President Pezeshkian? Is it some of the other names we've heard? Qalibaf, who's the Speaker of the Parliament? Is it Ahmed Vahidi? Is it the IRGC in general? What can you tell us about who is running the country and whether it is being run centrally, or perhaps it's just broken up into different factions?
Well, it's certainly not President Pezeshkian. President Pezeshkian, in my view, is one of the weakest, if not the weakest, president in Iran since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. But I would say that it's very difficult for us, especially based on open sources, to figure out what are the internal dynamics right now in Tehran. It's very clear that Supreme Leader is Mujtaba. If he's isolated, if he's capable of making decisions, it's very clear that everyone is expecting to get some kind of approval from Mujtaba, but it's not that clear whether he makes the decisions. So I would say that at least for now, and as long as he seems to be in some kind of isolation with very limited access to the other high-ranking officials, both military and political officials in Iran, it seems to us that there seems to be some kind of collective leadership. Perhaps the most important one is Qalibaf, the chairman of the Iranian Majlis, but of course he's much more than that. Until recently, he actually ruled Iran alongside Ali Larijani, the secretary of the SNSC, the Supreme National Security Council. But after Larijani was killed by Israel, Qalibaf was left alone. So it's quite likely that he makes decision with some kind of assistance or coordination with other political and military officials in Iran, the commander of the Revolutionary Guards, Ahmed Vahidi, the new secretary of the SNSC, perhaps even President Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Arakchi. But at the end of the day, it seems to us that they make decisions together. And at the end of the day, they still need to get some kind of approval from Mujtaba. I think, by the way, that one of the most important questions is whether at some point, perhaps only after the war, what kind of relationship we will have between the different power centers inside Iran.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Qalibaf? They say that he is a hardliner. He's a real believer. Um, can you take us into the person a little bit? What can we say about him? What he believes? Where he could be steering the country, if indeed he is running it?
Look, Qalibaf is certainly affiliated with the more conservative hardliner inside Iran. But I have to remind you that when he was the mayor of Tehran about 20 years ago, he was actually considered to be a pragmatic. I wouldn't say moderate because he was certainly not moderate, but he was more pragmatic. Actually, one of the early reports about the political involvement of Mujtaba Khamenei in the state affairs in Iran was a report going back to 2005 during the presidential elections in Iran, where according to one report, Mujtaba, convinced his father Khamenei, Ali Khamenei, to support former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad over Qalibaf, who was also a candidate, because he said that Qalibaf was actually too moderate. But then, when he was elected as the chairman of the Majlis, he was certainly elected from within the ranks of the conservative hardliners faction in Iran. Although I have to say that at some point he supported the more pragmatic approach. At other points he was more hardliner. I think that it's important to say that he's an insider. He was the commander of the IRGC Air Force, so he has very good connections with the Revolutionary Guards going back to the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War. He was also the commander of the law enforcement forces inside Iran. He even signed this famous letter sent in 1999 during the students' riots inside Iran. It was a letter signed by dozens of IRGC top generals to the former president Khatami, actually threatening that if he doesn't take measures against the students, they will interfere. So I would say that on the one side, he's a conservative hardliner. On the other side, he seems to be quite pragmatic, and I would say also opportunistic. And that's also something which we have to take into consideration, because he might be in a position which could allow him to make decisions which are more affected by his pragmatic, opportunistic nature, rather than just being like Ayatollah Khamenei, obsessed with this kind of revolutionary ideology alone.
So let's just define our terms here, because we often hear these terms. There's a pragmatic camp in the regime, and then there's a hardliner camp. Pragmatic camp, what does that mean? They're obviously not Western liberals. How accommodating would they be? How deeply would that camp, if there is even a camp defined as such, how deeply how deeply do they believe in the ideals and the mission of this revolution? And a hardliner, what does that mean? Do they want to push Iran even in a more aggressive direction? So if you could just give us a little bit of a definition of these camps, and do they even exist as defined camps?
Yeah, it's very difficult to define the factions inside Iran according to Western definitions. I mean, especially today, 20 years ago when we discussed the political system in Iran, we used to say that the major division is between conservatives and reformists. Reformists were still committed to the ideology of the Islamic Republic. They were not liberals. They were not certainly not after regime change, but they wanted to adapt, I would say, the Islamic revolutionary ideals in a way which will help the Islamic Republic to survive by trying to bridge the gap, the growing gap, I would say, between the Islamic Republic and the Iranian population. Now, today, the reformists are gone. I mean, there is no representation to the reformist movement within the decision-making process inside Iran. And so we have either hardliners or pragmatic conservatives, like someone like Larijani or Qalibaf. They are all insiders. They are all very committed to the Islamic Republic, to the core ideological ambitions of Iran. But let me go back to what happened in Iran after the 12-day war in June. After the 12-day war in June, we actually saw some kind of debate going on inside Iran even within the decision-making elements inside Iran, between the more pragmatic elements, like someone like President Pezeshkian, like perhaps Foreign Minister Arakchi, certainly former President Hassan Rouhani, who is a real pragmatist, I would say. They did not say we want to abandon the core strategic goals of Iran. We are still committed to Iran supporting its allies and proxies in the region. We still want Iran to be able to hold its nuclear program, its ballistic missiles program. But Iran, in order to survive, in order to be able to sustain, it has to first to adapt some of its ideological visions into a more pragmatic policy, and we have to prioritize dealing with our domestic problems as the first objective. So someone like President Pezeshkian came up and said, okay, if we want to survive, we have to go back to negotiations with the United States in order to reach some kind of sanctions relief. We have to give more money to solve our internal economic crisis, our shortages of water and electricity. That doesn't necessarily mean that we will not give any kind of support to our allies in the region, but it's more important to concentrate inside. On the other hand, you had the hardliners led by Ayatollah Khamenei and other high-ranking officials, for example, within the Revolutionary Guard, who said, no, we surely should draw the lessons from the 12-day war, but we should not divert from the revolutionary resistance path of the missiles program, our nuclear program, our support to our allies. So at the end of the day, it's not a debate between liberal, pro-Western and hardliners. It's between different factions which are all committed to the Islamic Republic. They want the Islamic Republic to survive. The only debate is what is the best way to reach that objective.
So let's take stock of where you think the war stands now in terms of what the U.S. and Israel have achieved. Of course, the war could end any day now, given that Trump is in the driver's seat. So let's talk about militarily. How much damage has been done to the Iranian military, whether that's the Navy, Air Force, missile forces, industry? Let's just talk about the military side of the achievements so far.
So, on the one hand, you can certainly say that the Iranian military capabilities were certainly degraded. Its missiles capacities, its aerial defense system, or what was left of it after the Israeli attack back in June, the Iranian Navy, the Iranian command and control. Let me focus mostly on what, from the Israeli point of view, is the number one, or the two main objectives militarily from the Israeli point of view. One is the missiles capacities, and the other one is the nuclear issue, which we can elaborate later on. The missiles capacities, and again, I want to go back to the 12-day war in June. In June, Israel certainly managed to degrade very significantly Iran's ballistic missiles capacities. But what Israel did back then was to target mostly Iran's missiles and launchers. And so after the war, the number of launchers certainly reduced compared to what Iran had before the war. But the main problem was that immediately after the war, Iran started its efforts to reconstitute its missiles capabilities. And the problem was that Israel managed to neutralize rather than to destroy much of the launchers. And that the reason for that is that, as we know, at least some of the launchers and missiles are being kept in those underground compounds the Iranians define or refer to as the missile cities all over Iran, and they're very difficult to hit. So what Israel and the United States are trying to do right now is not just to strike Iran's missiles or launches, but also to strike the production lines of the missiles themselves to make it much more difficult for Iran to recover. The problem is that I mean both the Israelis and the Americans, still have a lot of problems to deal with the underground compounds because they are very deep into under the ground. And so if this war ends with hundreds of missiles and launchers still exist in those tunnels, the Iranians will do just what they did after June. They will have to get all those blocks Israel and the United States managed to do to block the exits and entrances to those tunnels, get all those missiles and launchers out. And the question is whether it's really going to be more difficult for Iran to recover its production lines due to the fact that this time they were also being hit by the US and Israel.
So let's go down into the nuclear issue. There's that 440 something kilograms of highly enriched uranium. Where do you think the nuclear program stands? How quickly, if this war ends, could Iran decide to push forward and start enriching again and recover that material and rebuild?
So here I think we have to make a distinction between the intentions and the capabilities. Concerning the intentions, my assessment is that the war actually strengthened and increased the Iranian motivation to break out. By the way, I have to say that over the last year or two, we followed the statements coming from Iran concerning what they say about Iran's nuclear doctrine. And there were more and more voices being heard in Iran saying, look, if we can no longer use our proxies in the region to deter Israel because of the weakening of the so-called axis of resistance over the last 2.5 years, and if we can't use our ballistic missiles to deter Israel, we can certainly use them in order to retaliate, but not to deter Israel. The only way we can perhaps deter Israel and the United States is by getting the ultimate deterrence, which is a nuclear weapon. And so there were some voices inside Iran saying for many years, Iran has tried to maintain its position as a threshold nuclear state, but this is no longer enough. We have to move forward and break out to nuclear weapon. Today, I think the conclusion in Iran is that those voices were right, and that Iran should do that. And we also have to remember that the fatwa, the Islamic fatwa, affiliated with Ali Khamenei, banning the production of nuclear weapon, is no longer there. And so we can assume that Mujtaba, the new leader, might indeed change Iran's nuclear doctrine and supporting not just Iran's threshold position, but also to break out. The question is here, of course, is not just the intention, but what the capabilities are. Now, if this war ends with the 440 kilograms of enriched uranium to 60% still left inside Iran, and not taking out either through some kind of military operation or through some kind of agreement between Iran and the United States, it's only a matter of either weeks or months before the Iranians can take this material, enrich that to 90%, then convert that to uranium metal, and in a matter of few months, they can certainly carry out some kind of nuclear explosion. That, by the way, doesn't mean that they have the full-scale operational ability to hit Israel, because that would require missiles with nuclear device capable of reaching Israel. But if they manage to produce a nuclear warhead, this by itself will be a very significant development. And that actually means that if at the end of the war they still have an access to this material, and of course they have a lot of other capabilities as well, fissile material to 20%, and less than that, advanced centrifuges, nuclear scientists, knowledge, know-how. If they still have those, we might be forced into another round of war with Iran in case either Israel or the United States detect with their intelligence services any attempt by the Iranians to get hold of this material or to resume enrichment and certainly to break out.
So the final piece of this is, of course, the regime change element. Neither Netanyahu or Trump have said explicitly that this is a goal, but of course, Netanyahu hints at it all the time, talks about creating the conditions for the Iranian people to rise up. Do you see that those conditions are in place? And do you see any evidence that the Iranian people could rise up in the coming weeks or months?
So this, I think, is perhaps the most complicated issue to try and assess, because right now, at this point, and we still might have several weeks of war if there is no ceasefire. But at this point, despite all the attempts by Israel and the United States to decapitate top Iranian generals and officials, including Khamenei, to strike IRGC, Revolutionary Guards, Basij, law enforcement forces headquarters, bases, checkpoints. Despite of all those efforts, we have no indication that the regime is still not intact. Actually, what we see, just to give you one example, despite all those attacks against the headquarters and bases of the Basij and the law enforcement forces, we still know that they are using other ways to continue their presence inside Iran. So instead, for example, instead of using the headquarters and bases, they set up tents or temporary headquarters in schools, in sports stadiums, which allow them to continue their efforts. What we get from inside Iran is reports that still, when the people go to the street, they still see a very significant presence of the security forces in Iran. There are still a lot of arrests, some executions. So we have no indication that they're not in control. The question, of course, is what will happen when, if and when hundreds of thousands or millions of Iranians are going to go back to the streets after this war is over. Because as long as the war is still around and the missiles and jets are above the heads of the Iranians, it's very unlikely that they will go back to the streets. But when the war is over, they might take this opportunity in order to resume their protest. And here I think the main question is going to be whether this time the balance of power between the Iranian regime, its security forces on the one hand, and the protesters on the other hand, will change in a way which will allow the protesters to get to rise up more successfully. I have to say, at this point, I'm not very optimistic because for many years I said that there are three main conditions to see some kind of regime change from below. One would be to see millions of Iranians in the streets. That could certainly happen because we know that the Islamic Republic still suffers from major crises and problems. Those were not resolved during the war. On the contrary, they became even deeper. The second condition would be to see some kind of coalition, organized coalition between different sections and parts of the Iranian society working together for the sake of regime change. And the third and perhaps most important condition would be to see some kind of divisions, cracks, and defections from within the ranks of the Revolutionary Guards, the Basij, and the law enforcement forces. Until now, there is no indication for that. So I'm not sure that even if the protest movement in Iran resumes after the war, we might see the same result as we saw about 2 months ago when thousands, perhaps even more than that, of Iranian protesters were killed by the security forces in Iran.
Let's take a quick break and then we'll be back with Dr. Raz Zimmt. And we're back. So let's just talk about these ostensible negotiations and what the two sides are trying to do. Iran denied that any talks had been happening. They said that there were some minor contacts. Both sides have put out their demands. It's Trump's 15 points. Iran put out 5 points. Do you see this as typical Iranian behavior, that there is really contacts and they're just blustering, they're just trying to posture? Or do you really think that they're telling the truth and that there wasn't really any talks and this is just Trump trying to create reality through his statements?
Well, it depends how you define negotiations. I mean, my sense is that there were no talks, but there were certainly messages delivered between Iran and the United States through mediations, Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey as well, perhaps others. I think that for many years of following negotiations between Iran and the United States and Europe, the Iranians never said either no or yes. It was always either yes but or no but. So I expect the same thing to happen here. If someone really expects Iran to capitulate, it won't capitulate. I think it's very clear that Iran is not going to be ready to accept all the demands made by President Trump. And I think this comes from two or three main reasons. One is that we have an Iranian leadership which might be even more hawkish and more hardliner than the previous leadership under Khamenei. And not that Khamenei was moderate. No, he wasn't. But this time we are facing a new leadership which is full of revenge sentiments after the killing of Khamenei. The second reason, I think, is because this time they really want to make sure that if this war ends, it's not going to be just a temporary ceasefire like what they had after the 12-day war. They really want to get some kind of guarantees that this time it's going to be, if not forever, then at least that they will get some guarantee that Israel and the United States will not try to attack Iran anytime soon. And the third thing, which I think is very important to understand, is that from what we get from Iran is a kind of a feeling that they are under some kind of mindset of victory, or perhaps some kind of mindset of achievement. They really came to the conclusion that they were very successful in using the energy leverage, both the closure of Hormuz Straits and their attacks against the facilities and infrastructures in the neighboring states, as a way not just to force Trump into at least withdrawing, perhaps temporary, from his ultimatum given a few days ago, but also to come up with this idea that they are not ready to go back to the status quo of the beginning of the war. They really want to use their position right now to make everyone realize that Iran has a lot of capabilities to inflict major damage on the energy sector, global energy sector, on its neighbor countries, and they will certainly want to translate those achievements into a more stable, sustainable a new order in the region, which will take into consideration Iran's position. So all those factors, I think, make them realize that they can certainly continue this war until at least some of their conditions are met.
So you've spoken about some of their core conditions. They also have some others that I cannot imagine anyone agreeing to, and they insist that the war will not end until they are met. They say they need to have their sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz formally recognized. They say they need reparations to be paid by the U.S. and or Israel. Do you think those are actual demands? And if they are not met, then there's no deal? Or is this just a negotiating tactic? This is just their opening move in these negotiations to try to get as good a deal as possible?
So first of all, it's of course it's part of the negotiation tactic. But look, I certainly know that I can imagine that they realize that they won't get any compensation for the war. But this, by the way, can be sorted out. For example, if President Trump is ready to give some kind of sanctions relief or to unfreeze some of the Iranian assets abroad, that could be considered as some kind of compensation. If they want their neighboring state to recognize Iran's sovereignty over the Straits of Hormuz, this perhaps could be negotiated within the framework of the region. At the end of the day, they won't get whatever they want. But my concern is not that they won't get whatever they want, is that the main objectives of Israel and the United States, mainly concerning the missiles program, the nuclear program, and the fact that we don't want Iran to use again in the future this leverage of Hormuz Strait, I'm not sure if those objectives are going to be met. And this should be the major concern right now in Israel.
Those are some pretty high demands. If there is no agreement in the coming week, what do you think happens next in the war? And is there anything the U.S. or Israel can do to really change the reality here and make Iran realize that they've lost and that they better accept a deal that Trump is putting out there for them?
So what I expect is to see further escalation, which would probably involve some kind of military operations carried out by the United States, this time using boots on the ground. We already heard the different possibilities of taking control of Hog Island. Another option is taking control over the Straits of Hormuz. The problem with those options are that first they are very risky because when you involve boots in the ground, they might be vulnerable to Iranian retaliation against those forces. And also, we have to take into consideration that just like the Iranians implemented their threats in the past to retaliate to any kind of attacks against power stations in Iran or civilian facilities and infrastructures inside Iran, they will do the same against infrastructures, facilities, especially in the Gulf states. So I really we have to believe that if the United States, for example, tries to take control over the island of Hark, this could certainly have an impact, perhaps not immediately, on the economic costs Iran will have to pay. But in the meantime, Iran can certainly deliver its threats to target oil and energy and perhaps other civilian infrastructures in the Gulf, and in addition to try and hit the U.S. forces in this island. So in any case, this kind of escalation is not going to be limited just for Iran, but also it might involve the U.S. interest and also the Gulf states in the region. So this is something we have to imagine.
So can you just quickly explain the significance of Karg Island? And then we've also heard reports that the U.S. might take Abu Musa and the islands next to it, or Larak Island. So can you just talk about why those islands are important to Iran and what that would give the United States if they indeed seize them?
So Karg Island is very important because it's being used for more than 90% of the exports of Iranian oil. But I have to say that in addition to the risks involved to U.S. forces in Karg Island, assuming they will try to take control, we have to remember that the economic impact of taking control on Karg Island might take a while, because if you probably remember that after President Trump decided to withdraw from the JCPOA in 2018 and return the sanctions on Iran, Iran's exports of oil dropped from about 2.5 million barrels per day after the JCPOA was signed in 2015 to below 500,000 barrels per day. And they managed to survive. So it could take several weeks or even months until Iran will have to face the economic implications of taking control over Karg Island. So it won't help to immediately solve the problems of closing the Straits of Hormuz. Actually, Iran can use this period of time to increase its attacks against ships in the straits. So it's not going to be an immediate impact on the Straits of Hormuz. Another way to reach the straits is through taking control of the straits themselves. This is again going to be very, very risky. And therefore, any kind of decision, whether to take control on Abu Musa or Karg Island or the straits themselves, is something which, of course, we cannot rule out, but it has its own risks of resulting in further escalation in the region.
So there's plenty to pay attention to over the weekend and in the coming weeks: the negotiations, the military moves, and of course Iran's reaction. Thank you, Raz. Thank you, Dr. Zimmt, for being here and explaining all of this to us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you to Yitzhak Ledei for producing and editing this fourth wartime edition of Laser Focus. We'll be back next week. It might be a wartime edition. It might be a ceasefire edition, but we will have to see. So thank you for being here, and shalom.